Hello and welcome to Dossier OVNI, a show produced by Agora Médias. This is the 8th Dossier OVNI show. The last time we talked about the international actualities of UFO with Luc DINI, Pierre BESCOND, Baptiste FRISCOURT and Alain JUILLET. Tonight, we focus Dossier OVNI on the UAP news from the USA. We will discuss tonight 3 themes. Theme 1, evolution of posture on UAP in the US actors and cooperation inside USA. Theme 2, Aero, OVNI and NASA outcomes, where are we? Theme 3, cooperation outside USA. Tonight is very wonderful because we have guests incredible, extraordinary from USA, of course. But Luc DINI, maybe can you introduce our guest, please?
Well, I will do it very quickly, and I leave the possibility for our guest to add a few words. But as you say, we are very lucky tonight to welcome Dr. Jacques VALLEE, with a name in the UAP story, and who has been involved in that subject for decades, and wrote a lot of books about UAPs, and also is very, very involved in the development of new technologies, in the investment in new technologies. I will leave him say a few words about that. And we have Christopher MELLON, who's a former Secretary of Defense, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and for Intelligence. So at the crossing between the Pentagon and the intelligence community, who has played a very important role in the past years in the communication about the UAP not story, but the present story and the new events. So this is more than important to have him around the table. We have Alain JUILLET, who is a senior executive advisor in security and intelligence, and he had high responsibilities in economic intelligence. And Ingénieur Général Pierre BESCOND, who has been director of CNES, is a member of the COMETA organization. COMETA is a group of former executive people from defense and security who participated to a report writing in 1999 about UAPs, and this report is worldwide known, we have to say. And Pierre BESCOND is also a member of AAAF and member of the Sigma 2 Technical Commission that I'm chairing. So,
and Baptiste FRISCOURT.
And, excuse me, Baptiste, I'm very sorry. But Baptiste has a specific role. He is a correspondent for the debrief. He is very aware of the news concerning UAPs, and especially in the US. He has a strong link with the US fears about UAPs, so very effective in translating the news for us, and we are exchanging very frequently. And Baptiste, you participated to three.
Is the third? Yeah.
That's third, yes. So that's the third session together. So, well, I'm done. You want to say some words, Jacques?
Well, I've had the pleasure to work on this phenomenon both with French colleagues and American colleagues. I'm a member of the CNES committee, as you know, for several years. And in my career, both in science and in investment, I've continued to work with French organizations, especially investing in medical technology in France with French colleagues. So I've had the privilege of following the trends in high technology, both here in France and in Silicon Valley. I should confess that my interest in UFOs started when I was 15 and actually observed an object close to Paris with my mother. And later, the next day, speaking to a friend of mine from school who lived about half a kilometer away, discovered that he had seen the same thing with binoculars. So we compared notes, and there was no question for me that the phenomenon existed. There was no explanation for what we saw, and there still is no explanation now. So I think that's what convinced me that there was something that science should be investigating. Most of my recent work has been in computer science, and I've had the opportunity to work with a cadre of scientists in the US on the first very large worldwide database of cases that has resulted in this book that was initially, that data was classified and it now has been unclassified. So that's, I think, where a great contribution can be made to the subject by pooling data from different countries, as we do here.
Wonderful. We begin the term one?
Yeah.
Luc?
Yep. Okay. So, well, we open the debate on theme one. I think it would be very interesting for us to have your feeling, both of you, about the recent change in the American policy related to UAPs. Of course, things are ongoing, okay? But we observe this change, of course, due to the publication of articles in very famous newspapers at the end of 2017. But probably the move was already started before, and we would like to know where is the starting point from your perspective.
Well, there was a congressional appropriation to fund a research project which became OSAP. People mistakenly think when this came to light, the OSAP and ATIP program, that this was an indication that even though the Pentagon was denying it was interested in UFOs, it was actually secretly very interested in studying it. That is not true. This was an expression of congressional interest. The Pentagon didn't want the money. The Pentagon wasn't involved with the study. The Pentagon wasn't reading the reports of the study. The Air Force wasn't involved. The Army wasn't involved. This was a group doing its own thing. And unfortunately, that was not the intent. I'm sure Senator Reid and the other proponents in the Senate were hoping that the Pentagon would do a good faith job of trying to look at all the data and studying this. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. They had good people on the project, but they weren't getting support from the Pentagon. It was primarily unclassified work they were doing. When that money ran out and the Pentagon killed it as quickly as they could, there were a few individuals, primarily Lou Elizondo, who wanted to continue this forward. They knew there was something serious there, and he was very concerned about that this was going to be neglected. So he managed, using his own, some resources that he was able to get and pulling up things by his bootstraps, to sort of maintain some contacts and keep working in what became the ATIP program. I met Lou Elizondo in the winter of 2016, spring of 2017, as an unpaid consultant to the Office of Naval Intelligence. After I got to know Lou, I became aware that we were having intrusions on a regular, weekly, almost daily basis, and this had been going on for years in sensitive, restricted military airspace. I tried to take this to the Secretary of Defense. I had two friends who were direct reports to him. Lou and I Lou brought in Navy pilots. I made multiple trips from my home to Washington, D.C. At the end of the day, nobody would touch it. Nobody would take action because of the stigma around the issue. So at that point, I faced the choice of walking away from this, or as they say, breaking the glass on the fire alarm. So I decided to go public with this, and I was able to obtain 3 official DoD videos from F-18 fighter aircraft of some of these strange objects. I approached Politico, the Washington Post, the New York Times, negotiated with them. Ultimately, the New York Times expressed an interest in this and said they were willing to do a front page story. So I gave them the videos. That story appeared on December 16th, 2017. I thought maybe this is done now, I can walk away. Unfortunately, that story did not lead to any action. And my friends in the Pentagon, I called them and they said, we're not getting any requests for briefings. I thought the Intelligence and Armed Services Committees would be up in arms about this. Unfortunately, they weren't. So I then had to go back and approach my old colleagues on the Senate Armed Services and Intelligence Committees, ask them to please take a briefing, please consider this. That led to bringing in more than Navy pilots who met with the staff, and that really convinced the staff that this was real. Between the videos and hearing firsthand from the Navy pilots, they knew that those people had so much legitimacy, the pilots. That led the staff to have enough courage to bring it to the members. Initially, they didn't even want to tell the members they were talking about this, right? Because everybody had the stigma. So when the senators heard from the pilots, they too realized this is real, this is significant, we need to do something about it. That led to pressure on the Pentagon to start providing answers. And what happened subsequently was very typical in the U.S. process, which is the Pentagon resists, the senators and congressmen get more frustrated, they increase their demands, the Pentagon keeps resisting, and pressure builds in the Congress to take action. And ultimately, they created this office called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and ultimately demanded regular annual reports on this and so forth. So that's largely how we got to where we are today. And I think the senators, to their great credit, Senators Rubio and Gillibrand and some of the House members were willing to put national security ahead of their personal political considerations. There was risk in them sticking their neck out, and thankfully they were willing to do the right thing.
It's really incredible. And there is, with the senators, what's the kind of rapport you have with them today?
But I mean, one thing I should add to this, one of the senators, when President Biden became president, one of those senators became the director of NASA.
Yeah.
So Bill Nelson had met with the pilots, and that's why NASA today had a complete change of direction. After keeping the UFO issue at arm's length throughout its history, they suddenly had a new director who realized there was something there. And so that was just fortuitous, that was luck, but that was a very good fortune.
Luc, what do you think about Tuzan?
Well, I think this is very, very, very interesting because it clarifies the process. For us, it was not so obvious, or we didn't know exactly when it started. I mean, around 2012, 2013, we remember that, of course, we had already an interest in UAPs. Looking at what happened in the States, we remember of the interest from John Podesta about UAPs, and Leslie Kean, of course, issued different books and explained that it was a very interesting subject. She came to Paris, she went to Chile, and so on. So we were very interrogative about the process, the ongoing process. And by the way, we tried to analyze, I would say, weak signals. For example, the release of old files, archives, you know. You remember we exchanged mails at moment about Blue Book. there were some release of old files, and also from CIA. The files from CIA about UAPs, by the way, very interesting, because when you look at these files, of course, it's very difficult to read, okay, because it's blackened in different on different pages, so it's hard to read. But when you take time and you make research with keywords and so on, you see that there were some attempt of visit or contacts in the 60s. Carl Sagan, for example, came to France to meet people, and it is said in the file, so I don't know if it's true or wrong, but anyway, that's written. And it was said that he was sent by the US Air Force to make contacts with the French authorities at this moment and so on. It was not the right time, certainly, but we found different pieces very interesting. And I was very interrogative about why this release of CIA files in 2015 or 16. I remember we mentioned it in our previous report, so the ones we issued in 2016. Alain, you want to say something about that?
And I have one question for Alain, because you work in the past a lot with USA and about information, of course, with Secret Service.
Absolutely.
What kind of regards you have now about all this cooperation in USA and France?
We face a huge change because when I hear, what was the situation, and 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, it is clear that for the mainstream in France, for the people in general, they were convinced that UAP was a domain booked for and reserved for the science fiction writers, so it was not serious. So no one.
It was a little for the crazy man.
The Cometa report, despite the Japan work and everything, they were convinced that in the media, the main media, mainstream media, they were convinced that it was a specialty booked for,
but
for
it was 10 years,
so
10 years before,
the
10 years ago.
Yeah, the change have started when the first show as a Nimitz movies, Chris Mellon spoke before, have arrived. That is to say, the people have discovered, the public has discovered that maybe there was something behind it, but not understanding what was the reality. And for me, the key has been now the story of the Congress. When the French media and the French politician and the French people in general and globally have seen that the Congress was able to say, oh, it's really serious, was, doing audit, asking and hearing people, pilots, whistleblowers and so on. So in this country, clearly they have changed their mind and they have said, oh, it's something important. And that's fantastic, because I remember 5 years ago when you were explaining that only with the defense look, it was clear that when you are unable to stop something because you don't know what it is, it's a huge problem for the Air Force and for the defense.
But it's the same.
But when you were saying that, no one was hearing
it. It's the same thing in USA.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean for the public. I mean,
they
for the
have worked for a long time. Cliff Christman explained it. We have heard. We have seen Elizondo. We have heard about the pilots. A lot of people until Gross, recently the whistleblower Gross. In United States, people are more and more in the know. In France, it's different, because in France, people were knowing. Well, interested people were knowing it, but for the majority of the people, they were knowing completely the story of the UAP, seriously.
Yes, but
so now the big change is that they know, since the Congress, the US Congress, that is serious. And thank you, because that's your job, you know, you made it.
I should add one thing about the process that the U.S. followed. It may be clear, but we had a strategy and we stuck to it in approaching this. The reason we were successful was because we were able, and it was legitimate, we made it a national security issue. It wasn't about UFOs per se, it wasn't about science, it was about defending our airspace, and that gave the politicians the room to be able to engage. If we had gone in and said, you know, people are being abducted, or, you know, started talking about aliens, they wouldn't have touched it. It was only because we were able to make that national security case that the national security committees got involved and started to demand answers. Now, hopefully that will help science, and independently, Dr. Avi Loeb became interested and has helped on the scientific side. Now NASA's involved. But it's very important to understand that the only reason that they were able to engage and did engage was because it was a legitimate national security issue.
Baptiste, maybe you can do a reaction about the public in USA and in France.
We can't underestimate how important December 2017 was, because we wouldn't be here around this table talking about that subject if Christopher MELLON didn't do that work for us. So there was a real coordinated effort to legitimize the subject to the eyes of the public and the political powers. I think it's a really important step. There was, as Luc DINI referred, small signals that were emitted from different countries, but the kind of talks we are having tonight is identical in half the states in the world, because in 2017 there was that breakthrough in the New York Times. So I think we can all thank Christopher MELLON for the work he did at that point. It was a tremendous achievement to reach that point. And the other step of that was to continue on the legitimation of that subject, to have the political powers to act upon the information they were given. And people have a hard time realizing how tough it is to have a politician taking risk of his career for a subject as hazardous as UFOs. So I can assure the audience that it was another tremendous achievement to have laws mentioning UAPs and non-human intelligence that are actually in full debate in the first superpower of the Earth. And for the other side of the planet, they didn't have the same history. And I will ask a question to Mr. MELLON about that later. Because for China and Russia and the other part of the world we call the BRICS, the cultural status of UFOs is different. It doesn't have the same prejudice to talk about it. And what I would like to ask Mr. MELLON is, did you locate the origin point where the US decided that they shouldn't talk about it? It should have been kept secret.
Yes, I think 1953, the Robertson panel was the point in which the United States government said, we need to knock this down. And they did it for very specific reasons during the Cold War. They were afraid it would undermine our air defense, that it would jam communications. At least that's what they said in the internal memo, which has come to light. They said and then the Condon report followed on that and reinforced it and said students shouldn't get credit for studying UAP. They wanted to delegitimize the issue in every way they could. And it took over half a century to really recover from that. And of course, privately behind the scenes, many government officials were concerned in seeing activity. But that is the point, if that's your question, the point at which they decided to try to take it secret and keep it secret, that I believe was the turning point.
Pierre wanted to react. Just Baptiste, Pierre.
I very much appreciate this recent move from our American friends, because I had been working for a very long time with mainly civilian people in America, high-level people from NOAA, NASA in space operations, Department of Commerce, the Office of Technology Assessment. And at one point, when I took over the chairmanship of this JPON board, I said to them, we must open up and try and collaborate with people who would bring data to us and exchange our views on this. And then I said, I have a pretty good network in America, I'll do this. And I talked to some people that I knew very well in the US and asked them whether we could exchange data, work together on these issue of UFO. And the answer was, Pierre, they will tell us it's secret. So that was then, that was what, 7 years ago? Still pointed out as being secret. So that's a very good move that you made and very much appreciated.
Well, thank you. And I don't want to diminish the New York Times story. It was very valuable in giving people legitimacy and the ability to talk about it. It sort of helped give people permission. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to get the Congress stimulated, but it was still extremely valuable, very important.
Baptiste wanted to say something.
No, why did the US decide to give that level of secrecy on UFOs?
In terms of the Robertson panel memo, this was during the Cold War. And of course, during the Cold War, people were, you know, almost in a panic about the communists and the Soviet Union. Yep. And there was very deep concern about nuclear war and this issue being exploited. And I think the Air Force also was very uncomfortable with the fact something was going on that they didn't control and did not want to admit that something was happening in the area they're responsible for that they couldn't protect us from or deliver on or didn't understand.
Yeah, I would like to add a word about that, this secrecy environment. It was the same thing on the eastern side, on the Warsaw Pact and Russia. When we look at the documents concerning the UAP or the anomalies story on their side, we see that they conducted research both on the civil side and the military side. And on the military side, it was mostly with the involvement of the Secret Service, KGB, and so on, looking for some possible advantage on technology that could be applied to defense. Of course, and certainly looking at the possibility for these technologies, in fact, coming from the other side, from the NATO side, from the US side, and so on. That's the period of the 50s, and certainly there was a fear that this subject gives an advantage on the other side. And by the way, there was also a fear about having people panicking, you know, and so having instability of population in this period of Cold War. Then we come to another period where there is, of course, a different strategic influence from both sides, but with the first negotiation on strategic weapons. That's the period of the SALT agreement in the 70s. And by the way, and we were discussing that part before, I was very surprised when I discovered on the State Department website some old agreements that happened in the 70s between the US and Russia. The subject was about mutual warning in case of accidental launch that might be due, that's important sentence, to unknown objects in the airspace provoking interference with electronics. That was the core of the subject. And it suggests, I don't say that's exactly the truth, we should ask to the people who were in charge, but it suggests that there was some common understanding of possible risks and a need for mutual information. It was a start of something. And then we moved to the present period after possible cooperation but also tense situation like today. The point is why we see in the US this change about national security issue related to the risks in, for example, in air traffic, or the risk induced by overflight of sensitive installation by unknown objects, because this is not really analyzed in the same way or revealed somewhere else in the world, maybe in Japan. But if you take, for example, the Five Eyes and the UK, for example, the report issued by UK in 2006 was concluding to what? There is no specific risk in the airspace. We should advise the pilot to be careful in some case. So they are not denying the existence of some phenomena, but it's more related to signs, possible unknown phenomena, and that's it. End of story. And it looks like they are still on that position today.
Want me to comment on that? Yeah, I think one of the key differences is between a parliamentary form of government and the form of government we have in the U.S. In parliamentary governments, these committees that look at defense don't get the kind of access to information that our Congress gets and don't have the power. They're all part of the same party. You know, I've talked to ministers in other governments, and they can't get information about UAP. The government just releases what it wants. So they may be having lots of incidents out there, like our Canadian friends. This doesn't stop at the U.S. border, but you don't hear much in Canada about this, and it's partly because their Congress doesn't have the ability to get deeply involved and get a lot of information and hold hearings on it. And that's, I think, part of the answer is the fact that our Congress has been able to get a lot more detail and insight and information about what's going on.
It's very incredible what you say, because we spoke about, we talked about the last show we did it here, and we have the impression, really, there is like a double power, like in USA or in France and Europe. There's a politic power, I mean, and something like information power, and they don't want to communicate. Why? Why they don't want? Between political, like Congress, or in France is Assemblée Nationale or something like that, and the people who do the information, like CIA or in France, DGSE.
Yeah, I mean, our oversight committees get incredible access. You know, I worked on one of those committees for about 10 years, and they really get very deep insights on the budgets, the programs, secret policies. And so when they start getting briefing, you know, there's an expectation that when they ask the Pentagon for information on this, they're going to be getting it. And in detail, when they want to talk to the pilots, they don't have any, you know, there's no resistance. They facilitate the pilots coming up and talking to the members of Congress. So, you know, there are pros and cons with each system, but I think in this case, it's a more open system, and the people in the legislature get much more access to the personnel and the programs and the details.
Yeah, it's not open source. I mean,
that's
it's not the website and the new technology.
This is from the military.
Maybe, except if Baptiste, you want to say something, it will be great if you can do a point about U.S. Navy now. What's the matter now in USA? The U.S. Navy is do information, go on this information with the Congress.
Well, it's interesting. The Navy was very responsive from the outset. The Air Force was very closed. They didn't want to share information with anybody, not just the Congress. They didn't want to share it with the UAP task force or anybody there. You know, this is incredible. The deputy director, the deputy secretary of defense, who is the partner of the secretary, set up this UAP task force, and he told this task force director, I want to know what's going on with this UFO issue. And you would think, in this era with computers and internet, you know, all these automated digital communications, all he'd have to do is make a few phone calls and he could get to the bottom of it. Well, 6 months later, 8 months later, the Air Force is still holding him at arm's length. He's still banging his head against the wall trying to get information. This is from the highest level of the government, the secretary asking for information, and the person he sends out to get the information is having a hard time and running into roadblocks and delays. But not from the Navy. The Navy was actually, when we were working with the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees to get the pilots up, they were very responsive, very helpful, flew the pilots up there at military expense to make them available to the members. Very, very different with the Air Force.
It's really incredible to listen to that. So US Navy is very open-minded, in fact.
Much more so.
That's it's always like that until
it's been like that for a long time, and it's interesting when you talk to people. I talked to the DoD Inspector General, and he said it's the same way when they do investigate. The Air Force is the most difficult to work with always, and the most closed. And the thing is, they never get called on it. You know, it's been, since MacArthur was fired, nobody's been just fired for not being responsive. And, you know, I think maybe that something like that needs to happen, because it's almost bordering, in my mind, on insubordination. And this happened to me personally. The Secretary of Defense asked me to look into something when I was in the Pentagon. And I called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and I told the colonel, I'm calling on behalf of the Secretary of Defense, and that colonel hardly had any time for me. He was just practically ready to hang up the phone. I said, I'm calling on behalf of the Secretary of Defense himself from the Pentagon. And still it was, you know, difficult and unpleasant.
It's incredible. But Luc, yeah, sorry.
No, just to, I would like to make a remark about the role of the Air Force, and especially at the time when the Nimitz event occurred. We are in 2004. We are just 3 years after September 11. And, well, I'm personally very interested and involved in air defense matters. And really, it was a very strong trauma what happened at that moment. And then, of course, the US Air Force was really in charge of the security of the US airspace. And we saw this terrible event that happened. So 3 years later, it is very surprising when the Nimitz story happened to have finally a report of what? US Navy ships, which are not so far from the west coast of the US, with F-18 attempting interception of supposed UAPs, and no story, nothing about any attempt of NORAD F-16 interception on that objects very close to the US coast. Where is the story? Where is it written? Yeah, we have no hint about that.
It's important in that regard. I keep raising this and trying to get some of the members of Congress to pull this a little, dig into this more, because the Nimitz incident happened right in front of a radar at Beale Air Force Base that is one of the most powerful emitters on the planet. It's one of our early warning radars. It's a radar about 5 stories tall, and it was facing directly at that activity where all those UAPs were. The ship could see them with its radar. How come that radar didn't see them, or did it? And how come we never heard anything about that data? So I don't know. I've wondered about that for a long time.
That's a question.
Before to go on to theme 2, Luc, Baptiste, one question for you. It's incredible because we speak about USA, and of course there is a lot of information about UFO and all that. But in fact, we have more information in USA than in the rest of the world. I think because it's a big democracy, of course, in USA. And why there is a lot of information in USA more than the rest of the world? What do you think about that?
I think it's not related to UFOs, but of the structure of information spread. So we are inside the Western Bloc. The main power of the Western Bloc is the USA, and all the mainstream media channels are connected together. So you just need to look at the press release of the Department of Defense, and you see them translated in all languages in Europe under 15 minutes, because there is a very centralized mode of information transfer with very few news agencies that share information, and they are disconnected from the other parts of the world in a sense. But if you go and look inside the mainstream news of the other countries, they are all translating themselves, the reports, with a bit of delay, but the whole planet is aware of what is happening right now in the US, bad that mean.
You agree with that?
No.
Well,
no. Because it's only true in terms of what we've been discussing, the visible national records and so on. As you may know, I've been part of a 3-year study that I led with some 25 or 30 people, translating data from, we had 2 Spanish interpreters or translators, we had a Portuguese translator, we had a French translator, we had 2 Russian translators, and then a team of analysts. The project was classified at the time. It's still partly classified. We built a database of 260,000 cases, selected among much more, those that the cases that had some verification associated with them, not just the raw cases. There is aside from what we've been discussing, which goes before Congress, which is reviewed by the press, which is in the New York Times, there is an enormous amount of data that goes back 50 years, 60 years. See my white hair? You know, that's where your white hair, that's where it comes from. My first job was at Paris Observatory. And at night, we were tracking satellites. And I had the card. In those days, you know, there was no CNES. We worked under the Prime Minister's office because satellites were strategic. I had a card struck by the, you know, tricolor of France, you know, blue, white, and red. And we were getting reports. We were tracking the early satellites. We were also getting reports from the public. Many of those reports we could explain. They had never seen a satellite like ECHO before, you know. So we would explain those. We had the job because we were working for the state. We had to explain things that the public reported to us. So it was completely civilian, unclassified, and open. So part of my job was during the day to take those reports and answer them. Some of them were UFOs. Some of them we could not explain. They were not satellites. They were not airplanes. I mean, we knew what airplanes looked like. And I started thinking, you know, of my own case when I was younger. How many cases are there that are never reported to the government? So I started asking for a little network within French astronomers. Have you seen anything? Because astronomers are at night, they're out and they see things. Other than what they're working on, they are also exposed to anything else in the sky. I started building a little file of cases from professional astronomers that had never been reported. They would not be caught dead reporting this because it would be the end of your career. People would say you were psychologically unfit to work for the government. So we extended that, and I found that there was a file of the French Air Force from the 50s with about 250 cases, and I got it, you know, because at the time, you know, my card with the French flag on it opened some doors. So it was not classified. They just didn't know what to do with it, and this was before the CNES created there. There were some fascinating cases. There was a case like the Nimitz, a French jet over Morocco, over Ceuta, C-E-U-T-A, down in Morocco. The radar had detected something in the sky that should not be there. The jet went after it, and they tracked both the jet from the radar and from the ground radar. They tracked the object. The object was capable of going from ground level to the top of the atmosphere in a matter of seconds. This is French files, 1954, okay? A lot of those things go back very far. Now, when I talk to people in Argentina, I've spoken to the head of the Argentinian UFO project. I've gone to Brazil 3 times. I've got to Russia 6 times. When you talk to the people who were doing the job, not the classified things, the people who get data in the press, the media, and so on, you find that there is an enormous amount of data. So we started collecting that informally, and we encouraged also the CNES to do the same thing. Dr. Hynek and I came to Paris in 1967 to brief the CNES about what was going on in the unclassified data in the United States, because at that point, France was thinking of dismissing the CEPRA or the early projects, because nobody else was doing it. I mean, France has been the only nation that had a consistent, thanks to Claude Poher, you know, a consistent study, not a big study, but you know, a few people. But those few people had access to all the agencies in France, and they could collect data. They still do, you know, all over the French government, and that's a lot of data. So Dr. Hynek and I, and we brought some specialists from the US as well, and we had 2 days of conferences here in Paris, telling them, please don't stop the GEPAN, you know, effort, because it's going to be very valuable for science. If you talk to scientists who have been undercover, you know, personally interested, I could take you around Silicon Valley, introduce you to CEOs of companies whose families have seen UFOs. They never reported it to Washington. Why would they? Why would they take the, you know, the public relation problem on their company? You know, if you're a vice president at Apple and you have a house on the edge of the ocean, and your wife and your kids have seen objects coming over the Pacific Ocean, why would you report it to the Pentagon? You don't need to. You have all the scientists inside to see whether that's... There is today a movement that is ignored, that comes from the high technology levels, that is extremely qualified in terms of science, that is thinking that we are on the edge of a revolution in science, not in defense. Before you can build a rocket, you have to know, the physics. We know the physics, and we have the tools, certainly the computer tools, like the ones that we applied, you know, to this database. This is not a database. It's a data warehouse with 15 different databases, all translated into English with an appropriate new structure. so that you can work on the entire body of information. Most of that has always been unclassified. Nobody looked at it. So I think this is where we are. This is a part of the problem that's invisible, that's not in the New York Times, that is behind the movement that's happening now. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to have disclosure, but there is an interpenetration between the people, like yourself, and the people who work in Washington, trying to move them, and the rest of the country. And more universities, I mean, you have, Stanford and Harvard. That's not a bad place to start. I mean, those are the two, most advanced universities in science among a very few number in the United States, openly, teaching UFO information and UFO research. So I think the world is changing.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Sorry, Luc, it's very interesting. We are going to be in the theme 2, and it's good. It's very good because thank you for that. And